Greetings. All right, so in last week's video, we looked at the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and how that contributes to the fact that those traditional societies were incredibly healthy and did not suffer from the modern chronic diseases that afflict so many of us today. And I'll make sure that the link is included down below in case you'd like to check that video out. In this video, we're going to look at the agricultural revolution, which was the first major change in our lifestyle about 10,000 years ago, in which we learned how to cultivate both plants and animals, which obviously had a major impact on the way we lived. And as it turns out, a quite negative overall impact on our health. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Nerdy Doug, or ATP, to take us through the research. ATP. Thanks, Doug. Let's move right into the material. We're going to look at three things. We're going to look first at an overview of the agricultural revolution, so what actually happened, then the changes that this brought to our way of life, and finally, the impact that it had on our health. So what happened? Well, about 10,000 years ago, in multiple locations across the planet, there were communities that developed the ability to harvest plants, and not much long after that to harvest animals as well. Now, this is a bit of a mystery as to why this occurred. Some believe it was due to climate change, others because it was simply a natural evolution of our ability to gather and start to cultivate plants, or a combination of both. But to a certain extent, it doesn't matter, because it happened, right? Now, the big advantage of agriculture is that it allows communities to extract more calories per unit of land, and that's a huge advantage in terms of sustaining a larger population. So what happened in each region was the following, using Europe as an example. So the first place where they learned how to farm was in today what is Turkey and Syria. And because of this advantage in terms of calories and sustaining a larger population, that slowly spread throughout the region, eventually essentially pushing out the traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle to the extent where it basically no longer exists today, except for very few and scattered and small populations. Now, say what you will about the agricultural revolution, but if it weren't for this revolution, none of us would be here today, because it sustained our global population growth, right? So what this chart is showing is estimates of the evolution of the human population on this planet. And I'll step you through the data here. So about 10,000 years ago when this was happening, most estimates suggest that there were 4 to 5 million human beings on the planet. So it had taken us 200,000 years to reach 5 million. And by the way, we almost went extinct a few times along the way as well. And then in just 9,000 years since the agricultural revolution, we reached 100 million. Now, it's still a long time, but incredibly faster than the first 5 million. And of course, that population growth has continued to the 8 billion individuals which are now on the planet. So we have to thank the agricultural revolution for our existence today. Now let's take a look at how it impacted our way of life. The first major change is that we settled down. And that was because with the agricultural revolution, well, obviously you're working the same piece of land the entire year, but also it provides the surplus calories you need to actually make it through the winter without moving on to look for and search for different sources of food. Now, this also brought the origin of stuff or technology, because we started having permanent homes, which was the place to actually keep stuff. And agriculture itself requires and benefits a lot from technology. The next big change is that we lived in larger communities. So as hunters and gatherers, most estimates suggest that the tribes were around 100 or 150 individuals, whereas with the agricultural revolution, it became communities of thousands or even tens of thousands of individuals, which obviously was already a very different way of life. And finally, and most importantly, we dramatically changed our social structures, right? So as hunters and gatherers, we would have lived in communities of hundreds. Well, we went in one direction, stored thousands and tens of thousands in the towns, but then we also went in the other direction and started to see the development of the core nuclear family. Also very importantly was labor specialization. Because of the surplus calories from farming, for the first time ever, not everyone had to have the same job, which was to chase after and produce food. So that allowed for the emergence of new jobs, such as what's depicted here, metalworking, which certainly would have been one of the first occupations. It also allowed for people to occupy roles of leadership, administration, etc. So you start to see the more complex social hierarchies and governments and all that good stuff which define our reality today. All right, so let's take a look at what this meant in terms of our health. And I would argue that essentially the agricultural revolution, it was a trade-off between quantity and quality. So the quantity, again, referring just to the massive amounts of calories that we are now able to produce, which allowed us to have larger populations in cities and so forth. But there were some trade-offs in terms of quality. The first one was actually crop dependency, right? So as hunters and gatherers, there were a couple of things. First, we could chase after our food because we were mobile. And the other thing is that we had learned to consume a large variety of foods. So if one wasn't available, then we could focus on others. Now, once we started farming, however, then we really became dependent on one, at most two crops, and maybe, one or two types of livestock, and that was it, right? So a couple of years without enough rain or too much rain, locust infestation, anything which destroyed the crop, that really left us without alternatives. And so this period was actually marked by extended periods of malnutrition and nutrient deficiencies. And there's research actually suggesting that our brain is smaller today than it was before the agricultural revolution. This actually could make sense, right? Because we don't always evolve to a superior state. We evolved to adapt and survive. And so if there were fewer calories, then it actually would make sense to reduce the size of the brain because it consumes a lot of calories, right? Okay, so that's the first one. The other one, this is interesting, is basically this was good news for dentists, right? Because the grain-based diet, it's a softer food, it's easier to chew. So over time, our jaws actually became more narrow, and that pushed the teeth together. So there was less space between the teeth. And you combine that with the carbohydrates from the grains, which quickly become sugar, and you actually had ideal conditions for the bacteria that live in our teeth, and then they would eat that sugar, and the acid produced from that is actually what causes the cavity. So this was great news for the future careers of all dentists, but it wasn't probably so good for us. The next thing is that this was actually a more difficult life than we had as hunters and gatherers. Now that's a generalized statement because there would have been a lot of variation among hunters and gatherers and also among farmers depending on the climate and the terrain and so forth. But in general, most research indicates that actually you had to work the land more as a farmer and that your days were longer and harder than they were as hunters and gatherers. And this also makes sense because now you had to be worried about producing a surplus. You're no longer just producing calories for yourself, but you're producing calories for yourself, for the winter, and for other individuals who no longer were working as farmers, right? And then the final one here is that this was a period where we actually started to suffer much more from infectious diseases. That was a combination of the fact that we are now living in much denser populations without the ideal sanitary conditions. And the coexistence with animals also meant that we started to pass our bugs and viruses and so forth back and forth between one another. So definitely a period in which we would have suffered more from infectious diseases than we would have as hunters and gatherers. All right, so clearly, it was important for us to grow our population, but the agricultural revolution definitely built a strong argument that we actually came out worse in terms of our health, right? And now let's look at some reflections on diet, right? So this was clearly the period where we shifted from consuming mainly, wild animals, leafy plants, fruits, nuts, etc., to a diet that was very anchored on grains and legumes. This was also the period in which dairy was introduced in significant amounts into our diet. This was also the period in which we learned to produce alcohol, although the percentage alcohol in the drinks would have been lower back then. So those were the main changes. In terms of the impact on our health, I would argue at this point the diet, it wasn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. I mean, we would have still consumed the grains and the legumes as whole grains or just roughly or coarsely processed. The dairy, when you look at the research with dairy, it's okay generally. The studies indicate that doesn't really contribute to the long-term chronic diseases, but there are some caveats, which are on the page here. The first one is lactose intolerance. So lactose is the sugar within milk, and many adults, they lose the ability to process this sugar, which leads to a whole bunch of intestinal maladies and discomfort. And then the other one is allergies, particularly with infants. It's the type of thing which usually people outgrow, even if they're allergic to milk and to the proteins within the milk as children. And as an extension of that, there's also this question of acne, particularly with teenagers, because that, to a certain extent, it's an allergy that affects the skin. But as long as you don't suffer from the lactose intolerance or these allergies, then otherwise dairy is fine to consume. I would just say that you might be suffering from a low-grade allergic reaction to dairy that you're not even aware of. So that's why I always recommend just experimenting for a month. Don't eat any dairy and see how you feel, see if it impacts your body. And actually the same thing could be said for grains. Now that actually takes me to the next slide and the final observation here, which was not surprisingly, if you look at what are the most common sources of allergies today, they are essentially from foods that were introduced to our diet as a result of the agricultural revolution, right? So you see here, like the recently cultivated, so that's milk and eggs, tree nuts being harvested, and certainly, and most importantly, the legumes. So with legumes here, generally meaning any plant seed, right? So that includes wheat, soybeans, peanuts, etc. Well, those are today the most common sources of allergies. The others, the fish and the shellfish, well, those would have been foods that were regional, right? They were not distributed globally as they are today. For a lot of us then, like eating shellfish is actually new from the perspective of the evolutionary histories of our bodies, which is why they do cause allergies in a lot of individuals. All right, so those are the main characteristics from the research into this period, and I'll hand it back over to Doug just to wrap things up. Thanks, ATP. All right, so this video reflects a core principle of the Revival Health platform, which is this idea that we were basically healthy our entire existence on this planet and only recently introduced changes that made us sick. Now, the agricultural revolution was that first wave, but what really made the biggest impact was starting 150 years ago with the Industrial Revolution. So a foundation of the platform is this idea that we need to address these changes and once again provide our bodies with the natural conditions in which it can thrive. All right. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did like it, please subscribe, hit the like button, all that good stuff. Otherwise, have a great day. Cheers.